Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Mirroring Project. This is a pronunciation approach for in-class, online, group, and individual pronunciation instruction. We're really glad that you decided to join us today. And as you can see, people are chatting out where they work, the level they work with. And so if you haven't done that yet, you can pop yours in there into the chat. My name is Suzanne McCurdy, and I'm a University of Minnesota PhD student in second language ed. But my former life and my real home is ABE, and I was an ABE teacher trainer and embedded PD specialist for about 20 years, mostly in St. Paul. And one of my connections to pronunciation is that I co-created and co-led Atlas's Pronunciation Study Circle with Andrea Eckelberger, and I encourage you to check that out when you have time and if you're interested.
And hello, everyone. My name is Colleen Meyers, and I'm very excited today to welcome you to our presentation. This is something that's near and dear to our hearts. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm retired from the University of Minnesota, where I worked with international teaching assistants, and now I'm currently volunteering with Literacy Minnesota. I'm also the co-author of pronunciation materials for non-native speakers of English, and I'm a frequent conference presenter, specifically at TESOL and in particular the Pre-Conference Institute on Teaching Pronunciation. And I often do the segment on intonation. So again, welcome.
And to introduce some of you out there, thanks everybody for chatting. I see we have people from Owatonna, Albert Lee, Stillwater, the Twin Cities. It looks like we even have someone down in Illinois today. Hi, Susan. And we've got people working with low-level learners, intermediate, advanced, LESLA learners. I saw somebody chatted out that they work with digital literacy, somebody else with students who are in healthcare classes, CNA classes. So we've got a wide variety of expertise here today. Thank you for coming again. So your learners, like we said, it looks like it runs the gamut all the way from LESLA to very advanced and different types of English learning. For Colleen and me, I worked as a teacher trainer in ABE. So it's a mix of schooling backgrounds, as you know, and the English language levels vary, both the oral skills and the literacy skills. While Colleen worked in the university setting, so college students, folks who studied English formally. And some of our students in ABE study English formally too, but we're going to try to bridge those two settings in this presentation today.
So next, let's talk a little bit about the objectives that we have for this session. And we have 4 objectives. First of all, we'd like to describe the Mirroring Project and explain why it can be effective for practicing pronunciation. Also, we'd like to identify how the process, and it is a process I'm going to emphasize several times, may best be applied to your own context. What we're really hoping is that you take this, go back home, and try it out with your students. The next objective is to have you actually practice identifying needs and growth in comprehensibility. So you'll be looking at a few short videos and identifying what the learners are doing well and what they might need to improve. And then finally, the last objective is to identify the best practices for the project. So again, when you walk away, you can have a clear idea of what you need to do. Okay, so let's start with what the mirroring project is and why you might want to undertake it with your learners. So first of all, it's important to know that this involves imitating the verbal and nonverbal communication of a native speaker of English or a comprehensible non-native speaker of English. Now, I was talking to somebody about this the other day and they thought it was shadowing. And actually shadowing is different. Shadowing is where you just follow along after the person who's speaking and repeat what they said. But there's a lot more that's involved here. Also, it's important to try to find someone with whom you can identify. And again, we'll talk more about that later. The person who's speaking can either be doing a presentation or a dialogue from a movie or a sitcom or whatever. And when I undertook the process in my class at the university and with the ABE learners that I've been working with, I found that it usually takes about 2 to 3 hours. And that was spread over a period of 1 to 3 weeks. So 1 week, perhaps, if I was doing it in an intensive program, and 3 weeks if I was doing it as part of the curriculum. And Suzanne is going to talk next a little bit about how that might fit into ABE.
Right. And I saw that Susan chatted out, has Colleen's book that she co-authored been published yet? She can't find it. And no, right, Colleen? Still in the editing?
Yeah, good question. Actually, we're going to publish a book through Equinox Publishing, and it will be coming out in the next couple months. We just submitted the final manuscript to the publisher, and it talks about the theory behind the mirroring project. And then it actually goes through a couple of case studies with 2 individuals that I worked with at the university. And then it's got handouts as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
So here you see Colleen has the mirroring project taking 2 to 3 hours over a period of 1 to 3 weeks. Remember, that's in Colleen's classroom at the U, and that might match how long it takes you or how long of a time you spread it over. But please remember to adapt it to your needs at your site and the kind of curriculum and the number of times you meet every week. Along with that, why undertake the mirroring project? You can integrate it into your curriculum because either you or the students are choosing the videos or the speakers that are being mirrored. That can come in nicely to anything that you happen to be focusing on in your curriculum in the unit you're working on. It's fun and engaging. We always want that, right? No sleeping students during this. It's highly contextualized. It's not just sentences on the board with intonation lines over them out of nowhere where the students can't connect it to what they really mean in the real world, because it's part of a speech or a television scene or something like that. And it's video, so they can also see what's going on. And then, of course, it's authentic speech. What we really will hope that you use as the mirroring models are things that were not made for ESL students, but things that were made for general consumption, like TED Talks or movie scenes, that type of thing. So very authentic for our learners. All right. So today you're going to see that will move through 3 phases of the mirroring project. The first one, the analysis phase, where you and your students choose a model, analyze the speech and the body language, and transcribe the speech. The second phase, the mirroring phase, is lots of practice. It's a longer phase. You do trials and final versions of the speech. And then the channeling phase is where your learners have a chance to apply what they're learning to their words or their real world knowledge. And we'll see examples of each of these phases so that you'll get a good idea of what all this means.
So let's start with the analysis phase, as Suzanne just mentioned, and we'll go into the next slide.
Oh.
So the very first step is choosing a model. And there are a couple of ways that you can do this. First of all, the teacher could choose the same model for the whole class, or provide a limited number of choices and let students choose. Or the students can choose their own model, and sometimes a combination of these. And so we'll take these and break them down and talk about pros and cons step by step. And Suzanne is going to start with the first approach.
Okay, so you can choose the same model for the whole class. That is, find a video that everyone's watching, everyone's mirroring. The pros for this is that you can move the students through at the same pace, so you don't have people all over the place at different levels. You can carefully integrate what you're already talking about in class, your curricular topics and vocabulary. So if you get to choose it, you can really integrate it into the curriculum. You have all that control over the content. You can have the transcript ready. So that's a pretty big piece. If your learners are not at the place where they could transcribe what's going on in the video, or they choose a piece that doesn't have a transcript already ready, that can be a lot of work. So you can just have the transcript ready to go. It could take less time overall because everyone's at the same pace doing the same thing. And your students can help each other if you choose the same model, because they all will just have that, that ready knowledge about what's going on with that exact speech. The cons, something central to the mirroring project at the U, when Colleen is doing it, is that the students get to choose who they model. So in this, they don't get to choose. So you take away a little bit of that. And with that, the learners may not identify with the model. It might be a model that's a little too easy for them or a little too hard. So those folks at the extreme ends of your class may become disinterested. So another choice that's a little bit less precise than having one choice is to have a limited number of choices that the students get to choose from. With that, they have the choice. You can still have the transcripts ready, and it's still less work than if every student chooses their own. Because with every student choosing their own, you will need to help them vet the videos, help them choose appropriate places to do the mirroring, etc. And with this, perhaps you only have 3 videos that you really need to delve into. The cons, similar to having one video, is that the learner still may not identify with any of the choices. And it's a little bit more work than that previous choice of just having one video.
And then the third possibility is where learners choose their own model. And one permutation is that you can have all of the students do the same model just to acquaint them with the project. And then after that, you can say, okay, now everybody go out and find your own model. Another pro, of course, is that it makes it more interesting for other learners as they view the performances, because instead of everybody watching the other students perform the same model, they can see different models and different performances. And the last pro is that learners can really find a person with whom they can identify. As I mentioned, that's a big part of it, is to locate someone that they want to sound like. And so it's easier if they choose their own model. On the other hand, some cons might be that it could be more work for the teacher. So providing guidance, feedback, vetting choices, and learners may choose an inappropriate model. But one thing that we do, and we have a handout for you that goes through this, is we actually will ask the students, who would you like to choose? Why is this person important for you? And what, if any, challenges will you face? And so by getting that information from the students in advance, then we can vet and we can say, well, I don't think that's a very good choice for whatever reason. And then perhaps guide them to find somebody who's a better choice. And then the third con is learners may have a harder time following others due to lack of context. But one way that I've overcome that is I will ask students before they perform the mirroring project, just give us a short sentence based on who you're mirroring and what they're doing. So for example, I'm mirroring Steve Jobs as he's introducing the iPhone. So something like that.
Colleen, we just got a little bit of intel from Susan Johnson down in Illinois, who has employed this in an ABE setting. So I'll just let you know what she said.
Oh, sure.
So much instructional time was lost when students chose their own models in her setting. And also, they often chose videos in which the speaker's content included highly specialized vocabulary. When we used the same model, students practiced the script together and they literally mirrored each other.
That's right. She shared that with us.
Yeah, we have an informant here, and it's really good to know, to have somebody who's put this into the ABE setting. Love it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Okay, so the next thing is to think more about what makes an effective model versus what makes an ineffective model. And so rather than telling you right away, what we'd like you to do is chat out what you think teachers and or learners should look for in a model. So I'll give you about 3 minutes, a minute to think and write, and then I will go through your points with the whole group and we'll talk about it. So go ahead and start writing. Okay, so I see people are writing some really important points here. Carol said someone who enunciates well. Yes, and that's one of the advantages of having video, especially if you've got somebody, you know, close up so that you can see their face. Interesting content, relatable. Yes, Lorna, I totally agree. Someone who speaks at a slower pace, says Dave. Yes, I can't tell you the number of times that I've found somebody that is talking about something interesting, but they speak too fast. And especially if you're working with those lower level learners. Danielle says someone who is in a setting in which students often find themselves. Yes. For example, I often use TED Talks, and that's because some of my learners have to give presentations. And so the setting is similar to giving a presentation. Kristen says vocabulary that is in their range. And that gets back to what Susan was saying, that we don't want to choose something that has vocabulary that students are going to stumble over. The next person said language matches student level. And even though this is authentic speech, it's a little bit harder, but you can often find language that is shorter and matches their level. We have some examples, not that we've shared today, but some examples from movies where they're just short sentences with easy vocabulary. Mia says slower speech, shorter in length, someone who is looking at the camera. And yes, all of those are important, and especially someone who's looking at the camera, because then you can see that body language as well, the facial expressions, the gestures. Let's see, Susan says, a model whose speech is a realistic goal to aspire to. Yes, so again, thinking about the level of the students and their goals. Interesting content. Yeah, we talked about that before. Inclusive, yes, and that gets back to finding someone, for example, who's a comprehensible non-native speaker of English. It doesn't necessarily have to be just a native speaker. And I remember once when one of my Chinese students came up to me, because originally I was having the students just mirror native speakers. And she said, can I do a non-native speaker? And actually the non-native speaker that she chose was fantastic. Best idea ever. Sarah says someone who maybe speaks the same native language that the student does, but is speaking English in the video. Actually, we're going to see that with Shakira. She's a native Spanish speaker, and my student who mirrored her and channeled her is a native Spanish speaker. Someone with an easy accent, Vicky points out. Yes, that's important, easy to mirror. Chris says maybe various roles so students can see how pronunciation speech changes when you code switch in different settings. Wow, you guys are great. I wish I had done this workshop before writing the book. You're coming up with all sorts of fantastic ideas and feedback. A topic or personality that interests the learner, Martha says, yes. Speaks clearly about an interesting topic, definitely, as Linda points out. People in the class can identify with in real time, purposeful communication. Yes, and that's why TED Talks or even dialogues from movies would be purposeful in the sense of getting students to learn how to use small talk with each other. Johanna says, choose something that's authentic to daily life of most or all learners. Movies have a lot of that. Someone with great pacing, engagement with an audience or camera, and interesting content. Yes, some of the models, or one of the model we'll show you today, has a lot of engagement, rapport. Speech ELL students may hear every day, but which we don't necessarily teach. Yes, Teresa, that's a great point. I totally agree. Have the right vocabulary levels, as we mentioned. Model is reflective of the students. So some of the same points are coming up over and over again, but they're still very relevant. Students can relate to in real life, situation to which our students are able to relate, situations that present a specific tone, opinion, or style that you might want to help students learn. Yes, that's a great point, Laura. Thanks for sharing that. These are all fantastic. And then,
I thought I might, Colleen, I thought I might pop in.
Sure.
These are wonderful examples of the effective model. And I just thought I might say that your students won't be doing most likely the entirety of a video. It might be 4 sentences or 10 sentences. And one example is that we have in the resources is a video of Jelani Hussein from Care, Minnesota. He's Somali. And the beginning of his speech, he's talking about his first day arriving in Minnesota, which follows a pretty clear narrative that we hear a lot of our students give, like the snow and how cold it was, that type of thing, which some students could really relate to and really get with that vocabulary. And then later in his speech, he's being a little bit more academic. And so you might want to kind of flip through a speech, so to speak, to see if there is a part that works for your learners, and not throw something out because of maybe the setting that they're in or something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Suzanne. That's really important. It is short. I don't know that I mentioned that, but the students are not mirroring the whole thing, but just a short segment. And so oftentimes that makes it easier to find something that's appropriate. Okay, so let's look at an example here. My student chose Shakira, not singing, but speaking. And so we'd like you to listen and see what aspects of this make her an effective model. We're going to have another shout out, or chat out, rather, not shout out, in a second about her. So be thinking about that as you view her.
Growing up in my country, when I was around 8 years old, I remember I saw kids my age who, instead of being in school, were already working in the streets, were barefoot in the park, kids like me, whose reality was completely different than mine, only because of the circumstances into which they were born.
Do you want to hear it again, Colleen?
Yeah, we can play it again. Go ahead.
Growing up in my country, when I was around 8 years old, I remember I saw kids my age who, instead of being in school, were already working in the streets, were barefoot in the park, kids like me, whose reality was completely different than mine, only because of the circumstances into which they were born.
Okay, so in the chat, write down what you see here or what you hear that makes her a good model. I see some people have already added things. And by the way, Ahuva, let's see, going back here, or no, I'm sorry, yes. In reference to the last question, said we speak NYC for practice dialogues. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay, so people are bringing up some important points. Sarah says, great thought groups and focus words. She's a good model because her pauses are relatively long and very easy to understand. Yes, definitely. Her movements to emphasize things. Yes, nice pausing for emphasis. So a lot of you are commenting on her pause, which is really important. has a mix of slow and fast-paced speech. Yes, that's one thing that's really interesting, is that she sometimes speeds up, sometimes slows down, and that makes her much more effective. Good pausing, someone to relate to. Yes, my student chose her because she's a Spanish speaker. Great pacing, chunking, good pausing, good pace, speaking slowly and enunciating, relatable, clear speech. Yes, all of that. And I would add a couple things. These are all wonderful. She's speaking about something that, oh, somebody said was not perfect, which makes her even more relatable. Yes, she's a non-native speaker. She has a bit of an accent, not a very strong one, but that makes her more relatable. I would also add what she's talking about is very heartfelt, and she's speaking in a very confident way. And someone, let's see, I see a couple more coming up here that I think are really great. She projects compassion. Yes, she's relaying that to her audience. And she's talking about a topic that applies to millions of people around the world. So the audience is attentive. Inspiring. Yes, very much so. And also, as we mentioned before, you can see her on screen, you can see her close up, you can see her from a bit away. All of this makes her a great model. So my student chose her as a model. Then the next step is analyzing the model speaker for the big picture. So starting with the big picture, who's speaking, what is their role or purpose, and how do they do that? So things that some of you have already pointed out: rate, pausing, body language, volume, intonation, and changes. As someone pointed out, she changes in this. She doesn't speak the same all the time. So we'll go on to the next slide and we'll talk about how does Shakira, so to answer these questions, how does Shakira feel about her topic and her audience? And how does that impact how she speaks? So some of you have mentioned things like pausing and rate. So how does that relate to how she's trying to communicate? So we'll watch it again.
Growing up in my country, when I was around 8 years old, I remember I saw kids my age who, instead of being in school, were already working in the streets, were barefoot in the park, kids like me, whose reality was completely different than mine, only because of the circumstances into which they were born.
Okay, so go ahead and take another minute or so and chat out. I see some people already. I'll wait a minute. Okay, so yeah, as Suzanne mentioned, a link to the video is in the resources. So if you decide to choose this particular video, it's there. Mary Jo, she's passionate about her subject matter, making the example personal. Yes, you can hear the compassion in her voice. Her tone changes. Yes, very important. You can see the connection between how she's feeling and her tone, how she uses her intonation. She's passionate and personally invested, feels deeply about her young peers and wants to educate her audience, definitely. Relatable. Yes, she really does relate to the audience. Her eye contact, you can tell that she really wants to connect with them. Compassionate. Her phrase, Kids like me. Yes, I'm glad, Jill, that you heard this and pointed it out. You really can feel her passion for us to understand the situation. Also, she uses body language, kids like me. So she's actually pointing to herself, using that for her emphasis. She connects her own awakening to injustice with what she's doing now, using her wealth to help address injustice. Wonderful comment. Thanks, Sarah. Laura, good use of inflection, tone, and changing them as appropriate to what she is saying. Yes, she's a great speaker in those respects. Speaks with authority. Very important. She's confident and she speaks with authority, but she doesn't sound demeaning or superior. And actually, my student wanted someone that spoke with confidence so that she could mirror that. High interest in her personal story. You can tell she's an authentic person based on the energy she gives off. Yes, lots of good points here. So again, you guys are fantastic. You've really nailed many of the things that she's doing here in terms of how she's speaking. So let's move on to the next part. So at this stage of the mirroring project, what we want to do is zoom in even more on the language itself. We've gotten at the big picture, but we want students to understand what's going on with the pronunciation. And so one of the things that I like to do is use this visual that comes from Well Said. And I start by showing the students the visual at the top with the cars that are all the same and at the same level. And we talk about languages and ways of speaking, because sometimes native speakers will perhaps speak in a way that's similar to this. But in some languages, like in Japanese or perhaps Castilian Spanish, every syllable has more or less equal emphasis. The intonation is very flat. And so this is one end of the spectrum, not that languages are necessarily at both ends. They're somewhere along a continuum, I believe anyway. And so that's one way of speaking. But what we want our students to think about and aspire to is moving more towards the other end of the spectrum. So where English is, with these little motorcycles that are very short vowels, and then the cars that are the longer vowels for the stressed words. And then finally, the bus, which is the punch or the emphasis, like she was saying, kids like me. So these words are longer, higher in pitch, etc. So moving on to the next slide then, one of the things that we want to do is give terms to these features that they've seen on the visual, and some books that can be used. Susan Johnson shared with us that she's used Well Said. I know many others have used that. Some people have used Clear Speech. Tools for Pronunciation is a website that you can use. And these are all listed on the last slide with links. Talking about the pronunciation features, and of course, this depends on the level. With ABE students, you may or may not want to use the same terms, but thought groups and pausing, the idea that good speakers speak in phrases with meaningful pauses at the end, the rhythm. So going back to the visual, the fact that in English, some vowels are very short, the ones in words that are not important, and then others are longer. So what we call the content words. And then that emphasis word, also known as focus or prominence, the word at the end of the thought group, oftentimes, but not always, that gets the punch, that's longer and higher in pitch. The intonation pattern that often occurs around that emphasized word. Sometimes the pitch will go up and down. Sometimes it will go up for certain types of questions. Sometimes it will be flat. And then the body language and how that corresponds with the pronunciation features. At this point, then I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne, and she's going to talk to you about some things that she's done.
Right. So before going on to the next slide, Colleen's learners, as she was talking about, can analyze the speech on their own to some extent. But what if your learners need a little bit more support? So you can do this partially or completely as a group, as we talked about before. So I just want to give you a little bit of a taste of that. Coming up at the next slides, I'll show you a group of intermediate learners, some at the beginning part of intermediate, some at the higher end of intermediate, a group of them figuring this out with me with a little bit more support. So I'll give you a little bit of background before we jump into the middle of this clip. When we start the clip, the learners have already previously worked on listening for pauses in speech. So in English, we use pauses to form thought groups, as Colleen mentioned, and thought groups are phrases or words that go together for the speaker, for the speaker's message. And the thought groups here are the slashes that blue arrows are pointing to. And then the thought group, the pauses are the arrows, and the thought groups are the red areas on the slide. So again, the learners already did pausing, and they have this worksheet in front of them. And then as we go into this video, we're about to move into listening for emphasis. That's that word in the thought group that the speaker stresses the most. And so you'll see that I try to use, we've been talking about thought groups and emphasis and prominence, but with this group, I try to use learner-friendly language. So you'll hear me referring to thought groups as chunks and emphasis as the strong word or the important word. And as we go into this, you can just watch to see how I walk the group through the concepts and how I use that learner-friendly language.
Every chunk in English has a super strong word, okay? A super strong word. And right now, let's listen to each chunk and listen for the strong word, okay? Does everyone have a highlighter? Highlight the strong word in the chunk. First chunk is strangers, right? There's only one word. So which word will we highlight? Strangers, right. So go ahead and highlight strangers.
Strangers.
Okay. Now they are everywhere. One word is strong. Let's listen.
They are everywhere.
You think everywhere? Yes. So highlight everywhere.
Okay, so as you can see, I used methods that you probably use when teaching other skills all the time. You scaffold little by little, you co-construct the information with the learners. When you're using audio or video, you can manipulate it by pausing it often and asking for the group to give you the feedback. And there are parts in this where we don't agree on which word is the strongest word, so we have to kind of tackle that together, but you move along together. Also, you and your learners, you can use that meta language I used here, like chunks, strong words, or you can create your own meta language with your learners together, whatever works for you. When this clip ends, the next thing that we do in that class is we move on to intonation and then to body language using those same group instruction strategies. And then after that, the learners worked in small groups to practice mirroring the model in those small groups together. And just so you know, a link to this video is in your resources, and a link to the video we are mirroring in the video is in your resources, a link to that too. And so here in our presentation, we're going to take a break, and next we'll talk about the mirroring phase. We'll take a 2-minute break because it's a short presentation today. Stand up, stretch, and come back in 2 minutes. I didn't know that timer would have a siren at the end. Sorry if that startled anybody. Before we go on to the next phase, Chris Kloss, you suggested or mentioned that we'd be looking for videos. All of us would be looking for videos of speakers doing different kinds of speech acts. So you could see the differences in tone and body language, how that changes with what we want to say. And that is exactly right. And please, if anyone finds great videos, pass them on to us, and we can pass them around as far as we can get with people who are interested. Okay, let's move on to the mirroring phase.
Okay, so again, this is not shadowing. So students are not just going to repeat after the video, but there's a whole series of steps that they need to follow. And one of the most important ones is practicing the transcript, scaffolding this for them so that they can learn their script and so that they can say it effectively. And so we use the read, look up, and say technique. And basically, this involves writing the script or the transcript in large font, one thought group per line, and then marking the pronunciation features that the students are focusing on. And one thing just to emphasize again, if you've got high-level learners, then perhaps you want to focus on several features. But depending on what you're doing or the level of your students, maybe you just want to focus on 2 features. So it's up to you and your goals and your students' needs. So
that's really important. Yeah.
Yeah. In the next slide, you can see here's a sample transcript from a TED Talk by Brene Brown. And the student that I was working with was a high-level student from Turkey, and she was working on pausing and intonation. And so this was what she did herself, actually. I've kind of cleaned it up, but she referred to it as a poem. She said, oh, yes, you want me to write what I'm going to say in a kind of a poem-like way. And so I liked her way of referring to it. So in the next slide, we're going to see another student actually practicing that. So this is P, and he's a Chinese student from the university, and he's doing the read, look up, and say technique. And the context is that he's using a TED Talk about try something new for 30 days, which is by Matt Cutts. So again, we'd like you to chat out what feedback would you give him? And again, he's a high-level student, so you might want to give him some positive feedback, but then what suggestions for improvement would you give? So we'll watch.
So go ahead.
Have you ever wanted to write a novel? Every November, tens of thousands of people try to write their own 50,000 novel from scratch for 30 days.
I'm going to play it one more time, Colleen.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Have you ever wanted to write a novel? Every November, tens of thousands of people try to write their own 50,000 novel from scratch for 30 days.
Okay. Feedback. What is he doing well? What suggestions for improvement would you give him?
Excuse me, Colleen, the postmaster came to the door and the dog got excited.
That's okay. You can't control that. No problem. Good. I see people already posting. Very good points coming up.
Yeah. These guys didn't need this workshop. Okay, so let me start sharing here. Let's see. Okay, so Sarah said, nice intonation and looking up at the audience, engaging to watch. Okay, so again, starting with positive. Carol, excellent tone variation. It will help to slow down so you can enunciate a bit better. Very important point. I agree. He has some good intonation, but he's not enunciating well. He's kind of mumbling a little bit and slipping over his words. And so slowing down. Chris, I could really hear that rise for the yes, no question. Yes, again, good intonation for that. He's chunking well. Yes, his chunks are good. There's something else though that goes along with chunking that we'll talk about later. Slow down a little bit. Yes. And how would you get him to slow down? A lot of times people say slow down, but I think it's important to think about, okay, what can help the person slow down? So in the next video, we'll see some things that we can do. Strength, as Heather said, intonation is very clear. Area for growth, slow your pace so you can pronounce the words more easily and clearly. Yes, good. Vicky, nice emphasis. Damon, not clearly understood. Not sure if it was the video. I agree. I couldn't totally understand what he was saying, and it wasn't the video. It was something he was doing. Danielle says, I definitely needed this workshop. Thank you. Well, thank you, Danielle. His intonation emphasis is great. He needs more practice making it real. Yes, that's true. He needs to take it to the next level. Looks at the audience, tries to engage. Okay, Carol says breathe. Yes, Carol, you got it. Bingo. Okay, George, you're doing great with stressing important words and using body language. However, I would work on connecting vowel sounds to consonants. So what we call linking. Yes, I also noticed that in some places he's not linking to make that speech smooth within the thought group. The fast pace could be nerves. Yes, that's a good point. Slow down, pausing and not rushing between chunks. Okay, so excellent points again, you guys. Thank you for sharing. Let's see. What I'm going to do here is I wanted to emphasize that when students are practicing the read, look up and say, you don't want to just say, oh, yes, fine, you know, go ahead and do it that way. If you notice something going on, comment on it and really help them. And as Susan said, they can work in pairs, get, you know, the partners can help each other. I also have students or had students in the labs to work with partners, and sometimes they would be even better at giving feedback than me.
So let's take a look at what I did and how I handled this. Okay, go ahead.
So like this, you're doing well. Tens of thousands of people
Tens of thousands of people
try to write their own 50,000 word novel.
try to write their own 50,000 words novel
Pause. From scratch
from scratch
in 30 days.
in 30 days.
Do you see the pausing, the difference? You have to pause.
Okay.
Just pause longer. And like I was trying to do with her, look down and then say it.
Okay.
Every November,
Every November,
tens of thousands of people.
tens of thousands of people.
Yeah, so then if you look down and then look up and say it, that helps you naturally incorporate the pause. That's the idea here.
Yes, so as I mentioned here in the video, he was speaking in thought groups, as someone mentioned, but he wasn't pausing. And along with that is the breathing that someone pointed out. We also call thought groups breath groups because you're supposed to breathe from your diaphragm. And I could go into a lot about that, but just basically to breathe and then say the thought group. Also, he could enunciate more. He's just trying to go way too fast. And by not enunciating and not pausing long enough, then that interferes. Also, as I mentioned here, and I want to emphasize it again, the reason for having the script and reading and then looking up and saying it is because the time that it takes you to look up and say it, it incorporates that time that you need for the pause. So, okay.
And this is important, right, Colleen? What everyone is saying here and what you're saying, instead of saying slow down, you give concrete things they can do, because oftentimes when we tell people to slow down, they start saying each word individually, right?
Yes.
And then their speech gets skewed the other way, and it's not as natural.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Thanks so much, Suzanne, for pointing that out, because so many times, myself included, I've said slow down. But what does that mean? That could mean pausing. That could mean rhythm and stressing. It could be linking, etc. Let's see, somebody said, how about teacher modeling correct sound? So what you're saying here is that we as the teachers should help him with the sounds. Is that what you mean, Manfred? Yeah, right. Yeah, here you could also jump in and help him with the correct sound. Okay.
Right.
And then someone said, explain the vowel to consonant linking. That's a good question. I think we'll save that till the end though, because that could take a little bit more time. But if we don't get to it, let's see, who is that said that? Huva, you can email one or both of us and we can explain to you what that means. Okay. All right.
Okay. So the students have been doing the read, look up, and say lots and lots and lots of practice. And then the next step is the trial version performance, which I think of as kind of a dress rehearsal for the final performance. And students can do this in front of small groups, or perhaps on Flipgrid, which I think a lot of you already know, but if you don't, it's a web and app tool that enables learners to record themselves, and then teachers and fellow learners to go back and post comments on that video. Or of course, learners can perform in front of the whole class. The second bullet point here, it's of course important to give feedback along the whole route, but the teacher and peers can provide feedback using a rubric, and we have some rubric examples in your resources. One that Colleen used, one that just has ideas of how to use more learner-friendly language. One from Susan Johnson in Illinois, where she adapted it for her ABE classroom. So you can feel free to adapt that as well. Or here, if you don't want to give your students a rubric, which it's good to give them a task so that they have something to listen for, but sometimes if it's a full rubric, their attention just goes down to the page and not their peer. So you could just give them 1 or 2 things to listen for, perhaps pace or pausing, something like that. And then finally here, recording for later analysis. This is really important because it gives you, the teacher, an opportunity to look more closely at their performance when giving feedback, because it goes by fast. And then the learner can use that for self-reflection and put your feedback against the video and just look a little bit further into it, and also remember the performance themselves, because we all know we don't remember what we did. It's good to see a reflection of what we did. Your learners could use their phones for this, or again, something like Flipgrid would work really nicely. Now, I know there's some students who don't want to be recorded. There you go. That's their choice. Of course, we wouldn't push any students into that.
And now we've come to step 5, which is voila, the final version performance. So this is the big day. And so one thing that I wanted to add as well is that when I introduced this, when I introduced it at the U or to my ABE tutees, I talked to them about it being similar to writing a composition, that you don't just write something and submit it and it's done. But similar to a composition, you might revise, edit, etc. And so once again, I'd like to emphasize that this is a process. So students will do the final version. They'll get feedback from the instructor and from their peers. Then they'll revise and practice, and then they'll do the final version. So again, they perform this, record for later analysis. Whoops, can we go back, Suzanne? Focus on the overall performance, including the emotion and the body language. So that's really important. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, we're going to see my student, and some people mentioned healthcare. This man I tutored, and he's studying to become a nurse. Liberian learner is mirroring Dr. Atul Gawande as he talks about how do we heal medicine. And so what I'd like you to do is, again, but we might need to do it a little bit more quickly because we're getting close to the end here, is chat out what feedback would you give him to take it to the next level. So remember, he's trying to mirror someone who's giving a presentation. Okay, so what is he doing well? What does he need to improve? So let's listen.
In the last few years, we realized we're in the deepest crisis of medicine's existence due to something you don't normally think about when you are a doctor, concerned with how you do good for people, which is the cost of healthcare.
Okay, so what do you think? Let's see what people are writing down. Okay. Oh, this is a suggestion from Lorna. For level 2 ESL, I think I might watch our Burlington English videos and see whether they are ideal enough to have students mirror portions of conversations. Okay, So just something for everybody to keep in mind. Sarah says a slight misplacement of focus in the final sentence, but otherwise really nice. Okay. Let's see, great tone of voice, pace of talking is good, but the pauses are just a little too long. Great eye contact and pausing. I'd work on varying tone for emphasis. Hand gestures seems appropriate. Okay, so he is doing things well. Sounded a little bit chunky. One thing though is we might want to go back to the original speech because I think he was chunking the same way as the original speaker. But anyway, we can talk about that. Great enunciation, work on transitions between thought chunks. Okay, I'm not quite sure, George, what you mean by that. Do you mean linking? Although linking is usually within chunks, but anyway. Okay, so let's see what he did. Actually, he decided to do this on his own. And let's see what happened when he made this decision. So go ahead, Suzanne.
I think if I stand, it will be much better than, sitting.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Go ahead.
Let me bring this closer so when I stand there, my face is shown. Yeah. Okay. Ready? In the last few years, we realized we were in the deepest crisis of medicine's existence due to something you don't normally think about when you're a doctor, concerned with how you do good for people, which is the cost of healthcare. There's not a country in the world that now is not asking whether we can afford what doctors do. The political fight that we've developed have become one around whether it's the government that's the problem, or is it insurance companies that are the problem? And the answer is yes and no. It's deeper than all of that.
Okay, we're not going to take too much time, but I think people brought up some really important points, which is build up his confidence. And for him, it was standing. And it's interesting that he was the one that mentioned that. And someone also mentioned that Dr. Gawande does pause for longer periods of time than somebody else might. Plus, it's a speech that he's delivering. So yes. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so the mirroring is done, but there's still one more thing that's important, which is channeling. And this was added so that students can apply what they've learned to their own speech. And for channeling, the learner will write a new script, a short one, just about 30 seconds. They try to be their model speaker, they practice, and then they perform. So let's take a look at my Spanish speaker, M, trying to channel. She's not mirroring, she's channeling Shakira. And again, we might not have a lot of time to talk, but think about how is she trying to be Shakira? What do you notice?
In recent years, people often ask me about the caravans from Central America and why do kids come to the United States by themselves. This is a topic that touched me deeply because I'm a mother and because I'm from Central America. In the past 5 years, thousands of people, including kids and teenagers, started to walk miles and miles, some of them with only flip-flops on their feet and plastic bags in their hands.
Okay, so some people mentioned some things. Yes, this is hard to hear. A couple things. One is the video. The other thing is that this particular person did have problems with volume. We worked a lot on that, but she has some physical challenges that prevented her from speaking more loudly. And but there are some things that we can see, ways in which, so as Mia mentioned, she's passionate about her message, relatable like Shakita was, her body language, telling the details. So I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne because I think we're about out of time. Otherwise, I would say a little bit more about her. So go ahead, Suzanne.
Okay, so we are out of time, unfortunately. Please feel free to email either of us with questions, and we will get back to you. We want to let you know, take-home messages, consider your choice of models. We have some in the resources. See what works for your learners. Involve the learners as much as you can. Remember, it's a process. And then the channeling is basically just if when they learn about these parts of pronunciation, bring it into other parts of your instruction, and especially times when they're doing spontaneous speech. You can remind them, be like Shakira or whoever it was. The handouts that are in the resources folder are listed here, as well as the resources and links that we mentioned are here. Any link to a video for mirroring or transcripts for mirroring are in that resources folder, not on this slide. So thank you so much. Sorry we ran over a couple minutes here. Again, please contact us. Any questions, or especially if you have videos that you would recommend.
Yes, for sure. Please do. And yeah, I have a question too for the interpreters. If any of the folks that were getting ASL interpretation, if they have ideas for how the mirroring project could be used for ASL, to please let me know. I have a friend who's learning to be an ASL interpreter, and she wanted me to ask that specifically. So again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day. Thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks so much, everyone.